Everyone has a breaking point. Mine came the night my daughter slammed the door in my face and told me, "You weren't invited. Leave." After 62 years of sacrifices, of raising her alone after her father's death, of putting her first in every decision, I stood frozen on her porch like a forgotten relic. What did I do so wrong to deserve this exile from my own blood? But that wasn't even the worst of it. Behind the polished smiles of her perfect family dinner, I sensed something was deeply rotten, something no one wanted me to know. And as much as I wanted to be welcomed back, to be loved again, I couldn't ignore the truth, even if it meant becoming the villain in my daughter's story. This isn't just about betrayal. It's about uncovering the lies that could destroy an entire family, and the courage it takes to speak up, even when it costs you everything. Margaret Whitlow woke before the sun, as she always did. At 62, her body no longer required an alarm to know the rhythm of her days. Portland, Maine, still slept beneath a blanket of early morning fog, and her little house, more memory than home now, creaked gently as it settled into the day. The stillness wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. 15 years had passed since her husband Daniel died. Stroke, quick and merciless. Since then, Margaret had lived alone in the house they'd bought when Amanda was only 6. The floral wallpaper in the hallway remained unchanged. The oak table with the water stain from Amanda's 8th birthday still sat in the dining room, untouched, unused. Every morning followed the same ritual. She shuffled into the kitchen, filled the percolator just like she and Daniel had done for 30 years, and stared out the window while it brewed. The garden needed tending. The roses hadn't bloomed right since last year, but she couldn't summon the motivation to care. She sat at the table with her black coffee and oatmeal, gazing at the photos pinned to the corkboard by the fridge. One of Amanda in her graduation gown, one of Amanda and her husband Ryan on their wedding day, and one of the kids, Lily and Owen, taken years ago at a zoo. None recent, none included her. Amanda had stopped sending photos a long time ago. Her daughter's texts were polite, infrequent. The last conversation was over 6 weeks ago and ended with Amanda hanging up. Before that, it had been another tense exchange about boundaries, opinions, emotional manipulation, as Amanda put it. Margaret still heard the words as if they had been shouted into the walls. "You act like you raised me alone, like you carried the world on your shoulders. But you had Dad, and you weren't perfect, Mom. You were distant, critical. You still are." She didn't cry when Amanda said it, but the words lingered like a paper cut, shallow, invisible, stinging when touched. Distant, critical, unloving. The woman Amanda described didn't feel like Margaret at all. She had spent her entire life trying to protect Amanda. When Daniel worked long hours as an accountant, Margaret was the one who packed school lunches, sat through piano recitals, and stayed up during chickenpox fevers. She had taken part-time jobs at the library and later a nursing home, never once thinking of her own dreams because Amanda came first. And now? Amanda's version of the past seemed rewritten. The sacrifices erased, her intentions questioned. Margaret pushed away her half-eaten oatmeal and stood. The silence in the house pressed in on her, thick and accusing. She walked down the hallway, past the old linen closet, and paused at Amanda's bedroom door. It was still painted yellow, Amanda's favorite color when she was 9. Inside, the twin bed was neatly made, the bookshelf dusty, the stuffed bear still propped in the corner. Sometimes, when the ache got too heavy, Margaret sat on that bed and stared at the wall. She never touched anything. It felt like touching a ghost. She walked back to the living room and opened the drawer beneath the TV. Inside was the letter Amanda had sent last year, asking Margaret not to give the kids expensive or emotionally loaded gifts without checking first. "We're trying to raise them without guilt or overcompensation," Amanda had written. "Please respect our boundaries." Boundaries. The new language of parenting. Margaret didn't understand it. She had raised Amanda with rules and love, not conversations about emotional balance. She didn't even know what trauma-informed meant when Amanda first used it. Yet here she was, a relic of a past her daughter wanted to forget. At 10 a.m., the phone rang. Margaret startled. No one called this early unless it was bad news. She hesitated, then picked up the receiver. "Mom?" Amanda's voice came through, tight and rushed. Margaret's heart jumped. "Amanda, is everything okay?" "We're having dinner Saturday night, just us. Ryan, the kids, me." A pause. "You can come if you want." Margaret blinked. Her first instinct was joy, then suspicion. "If I want?" she asked quietly. "It's just, don't bring anything, okay? And please, no comments, no stories from the past, just be present." Margaret inhaled slowly. "I always try to be present, Amanda." Another pause. "I'll try harder." Click. The dial tone buzzed in her ear. Margaret set the phone down with trembling fingers, her stomach twisted with something sharp and complicated. A dinner invitation after months of silence. But instead of joy, she felt like she'd been summoned for a performance. Welcomed back only on condition she censored who she was. Still, she'd go. Because Amanda was her daughter. Because no matter how many times she was pushed away, Margaret would always come back. That's what mothers did. 2 days after the call, a letter arrived in Margaret's rusted mailbox, tucked between a grocery flyer and a pension statement. The envelope was standard white, with the local elementary school's logo stamped in blue ink. She tore it open with a butter knife at the kitchen counter, curious but unprepared. "Dear Mrs. Whitlow," it read in neat print, "you are cordially invited to the spring performance of Peter Pan, featuring Annie Vlay in the role of Wendy. Friday, 6:30 p.m., Ridge Hill Elementary Auditorium." Margaret froze. Annie, her granddaughter, Amanda's youngest, was going to be Wendy. The stage, the spotlight, and somehow she was being invited? Her heart thudded unevenly. Had Amanda changed her mind? Was this an olive branch, a peace offering? But doubt crept in fast. Amanda hadn't mentioned it on the phone. If she'd wanted Margaret there, she would have said so. Wouldn't she? Margaret sat down slowly at the kitchen table, holding the letter with both hands like it might disappear. The last time she'd seen Annie was nearly 6 months ago on Christmas. They'd exchanged quick hugs, Amanda watching closely like a warden. Margaret had brought a handmade sweater, peach wool, Annie's favorite color. But Amanda had quietly placed it back in the gift bag and told Margaret they were scaling back on gifts that year. A performance. Annie on stage, her first big role. Margaret imagined her standing in front of a crowd, nervous but proud, reciting lines and pretending to fly. She imagined herself in the back row, hidden among strangers, tears in her eyes. Could she go? Should she? She picked up the phone and dialed Amanda's number with fingers that trembled. It rang 3 times before Amanda answered. "Hi, Mom." "I got a letter," Margaret said softly, "from Ridge Hill Elementary about Annie's play." There was a pause. "Oh," Amanda replied. Flat. "I guess they sent those to some of the emergency contacts. You're still listed." "I didn't know Annie was in a play. We didn't plan on inviting a lot of people." "So I'm not supposed to go?" "It's not about that," Amanda sighed. "I just didn't think it was something you'd be interested in. It's going to be crowded, chaotic. You get overwhelmed easily, remember?" "I want to go," Margaret said, surprising herself. "I'd like to see her. I'd like to support her." Another pause. "Fine, but don't expect anything formal. Don't bring gifts. Don't make a scene." Margaret bit her lip. "Of course." The call ended, leaving a chill in the room. Margaret sat still for a long while, heart sore. It wasn't an invitation. It was permission. That night, she pulled out an old photo album from the shelf above the fireplace. Dust clung to its plastic cover. She flipped through images of Amanda at 6, missing teeth, pigtails, a pink tutu. Amanda on her first day of school, clinging to Margaret's hand. Amanda asleep in the hospital bed after giving birth to Annie. She had dreamed of a life where holidays were shared, where they baked cookies together and argued over politics, but still showed up for one another. A life where being a mother didn't end with distance and silence. But somewhere, things had splintered. Expectations, unspoken needs, buried resentment. It had all grown until it crowded out the love. Still, Margaret clung to hope. On Friday, she arrived early to the elementary school auditorium. The building was buzzing with parents and children, laughter echoing off the tiled walls. Margaret found a seat near the back, avoiding the reserved rows. She wore her nicest cardigan and had tied her hair with the same silk scarf Amanda used to borrow in college. The play began. Peter Pan flew, Lost Boys danced. And then Annie appeared, stepping onto the stage as Wendy. Her voice rang out clear and proud, her presence commanding. Margaret's heart swelled. Halfway through the show, she saw Amanda and Thomas slip into the row up front. Amanda glanced back once, caught sight of her mother, and then turned away without expression. Margaret didn't move. She clapped when Annie sang, laughed at the funny lines, and cried silently during the lullabies. When it ended, the audience erupted in applause. As people filtered out, Margaret lingered in the shadows. She didn't want to cause discomfort. She just wanted to see Annie smile, even if from afar. Then a small hand tapped her elbow. "Grandma?" Margaret turned. Annie stood behind her, still in costume, cheeks flushed with stage paint and excitement. "You came!" she said, hugging her tight. Margaret knelt. "Of course I did, sweetheart. You were magnificent." "I wasn't supposed to tell you," Annie whispered, glancing around, "but I sent that letter. I told the office to print one for you." Margaret blinked, stunned. "You did?" Annie nodded. "I wanted you there. Mommy said you might not come, but I knew you would." Margaret hugged her again, tightly this time, her throat too thick for words. And in that moment, the coldness of the past faded. Just for a second, she was someone's beloved again. Margaret spent the entire Saturday morning preparing for the dinner she hoped would begin to mend everything that had unraveled. Her hands moved with a mixture of nervous energy and hope as she sliced apples for the pie, a recipe Evelyn, her late mother-in-law, had once perfected. It was Amanda's favorite as a child, the buttery cinnamon filling always bringing comfort during cold Maine winters. Maybe that taste, so deep in memory, could bridge what years of silence had fractured. She wrapped a small gift for Annie, nothing grand, just a hand-painted wooden jewelry box with a tiny silver clasp, something she had found at a local crafts market and instantly thought of her. Margaret even tied it with a ribbon, delicate as her hope. Before leaving, she took one last look in the hallway mirror. Her periwinkle blouse was neatly pressed, and she had dabbed a touch of rose-scented perfume behind her ears. Her gray hair, usually tucked in a bun, now cascaded softly to her shoulders. She wanted to look warm, not desperate, present, not apologetic. The drive to Amanda's suburban home felt longer than it was. As Margaret turned onto the winding street lined with identical houses and trimmed hedges, her hands began to sweat on the steering wheel. Amanda's home sat stoically at the end of a cul-de-sac, its windows gleaming like eyes watching for intruders. She parked slowly, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the silence, gathering her courage. The pie rested carefully on the seat beside her. She picked it up, along with Annie's gift, and walked up the pathway lined with immaculate rose bushes. Her heart pounded louder with each step. When she rang the doorbell, the sound echoed through her chest like a warning. Amanda opened the door with mechanical precision. Her face was unreadable. No warmth, no welcome. "You weren't invited," Amanda said sharply, her voice cold and clipped. Margaret blinked. You called. You said I could come." "I said you could come to dinner," Amanda replied, lowering her voice. "I didn't say I invited you. That letter? Annie shouldn't have sent it. She knows better." Margaret felt her chest tighten. Her hands clutched the pie and gift like they were the only things anchoring her in place. "I brought dessert," she said quietly, lifting the pie like an olive branch. Amanda didn't move. "You were not supposed to bring anything, and Annie will be disciplined for going behind my back." Just then, small footsteps pounded across the hardwood floor and Annie appeared, hair still damp from a rushed bath, cheeks flushed with anticipation. "Grandma!" she squealed, running forward and wrapping her arms around Margaret's waist. Margaret knelt, embracing her granddaughter tightly, burying her face in the soft scent of lavender shampoo. "I'm so glad you came." Annie whispered. "Please don't go." Amanda stood in the doorway, arms crossed, face stony. "Annie," she said sharply, "go inside." "But Mom..." "Now." Annie turned back to Margaret, her eyes glassy with fear. "Please stay. Just for dinner." Margaret rose slowly, looking Amanda in the eye. "I won't make trouble. I just wanted to see you all, break bread, that's all." Amanda exhaled, her jaw clenching. "Fine, but one word about the past, one comment about parenting, and I swear..." "I won't," Margaret said quickly. "I promise." Amanda stepped aside. Margaret entered the house, feeling as if she'd stepped not into a home, but a courtroom. Everything was pristine. The granite countertops, the white leather couch, the silent digital frames rotating polished family portraits. Not a trace of imperfection or history. Thomas emerged from the dining room, dressed in a blue sweater and slacks. He offered a curt nod, not approaching, not speaking. Margaret returned the nod, unsure how to interpret his stillness. Dinner was already set, salmon with couscous, arugula salad, and bread rolls in a linen basket. Amanda moved with brisk efficiency, directing Annie and her younger brother Luke where to sit, adjusting the candles, lowering the lights just so. Margaret placed the pie gently on the counter. No one acknowledged it. She held out the small wrapped box to Annie. "This is for you," she said softly. Before Annie could take it, Amanda's hand intercepted it mid-air. "What did we say about gifts, Mom?" "It's just a box," Margaret said quickly. "No money, no message, just a little something she can keep her trinkets in." Amanda stared at it for a moment, then placed it on the counter next to the pie. "Later," she said flatly. Margaret took her seat. The chairs were soft, but the air was hard. Every movement felt scrutinized. She smiled at Luke, who gave a shy nod and returned to stacking peas on his fork. Thomas remained mostly silent, sipping wine and glancing at his phone beneath the table. Conversations skittered across the surface like leaves on ice. Weather, school projects, Amanda's yoga classes. Margaret listened more than she spoke, afraid that even her breath might offend. When Annie began to describe her next school project, "We have to interview someone about their past." Margaret leaned in, eyes hopeful. But Amanda cut in. "We'll talk about that later, sweetie." Silence followed. Margaret folded her napkin slowly, her appetite lost. She hadn't come to stir trouble. But being present, as Amanda asked, didn't mean being invisible. The tension at the dinner table was like a low hum, inaudible but ever-present. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, nodding at each topic, smiling politely, carefully measuring every word. The silverware clinked softly. Candlelight flickered against polished wine glasses. Amanda asked about Luke's science project. Annie chirped about her art contest. And Thomas remained mostly silent, responding with short, efficient answers. Margaret took a sip of water, her throat dry. She hated how unnatural everything felt. She longed to ask Annie about school, Luke about his books, but she feared stepping on yet another unseen minefield. Then, in a moment of false comfort, she made a fatal error. "This salmon reminds me of the dinner we had the week Thomas told us about his first investment fund," she said gently, looking at Amanda. "Remember? You were so nervous, Amanda, but Thomas said the returns were already coming in strong." The fork in Thomas's hand paused halfway to his mouth. Amanda's smile evaporated. Margaret blinked, realizing too late she had shattered the illusion of peace. Thomas set down his fork. "That was years ago," he said, his voice cool. "Things change." "I didn't mean anything by it," Margaret said quickly. "I just remember how proud you were. You said it was almost too easy." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I don't need a financial history lesson, Margaret." Amanda's tone turned sharp. "Mom, maybe this isn't the time." "I wasn't criticizing," Margaret said, trying to recover. "It's just that..." "You always do this," Amanda cut in, her voice rising slightly. "You wrap your judgments in memories and then act surprised when people get upset." Margaret swallowed hard. "Amanda, No," Amanda said firmly. "We asked you to come and be present, not to rehash old stories, especially ones that don't concern you." Margaret nodded, chastened. She stared at her plate, her appetite fully gone. Annie looked between them, confused and quiet. Luke kept his eyes on his bread roll, cheeks flushed. Thomas pushed his chair back slightly. "Excuse me," he muttered, rising from the table and disappearing down the hall. The silence that followed was punishing. Amanda sighed, rubbing her temples. "Can you just try not to poke at things?" "I didn't think it was poking," Margaret said softly. "I was trying to remember a happy moment." "Well, don't," Amanda said coldly. "We're not children who need you narrating our lives." Margaret looked down at her lap, the napkin clenched tightly in her hands. "I think I need to freshen up," she said quietly, rising from her chair. She made her way down the hall, the walls lined with framed photos, none of her. She passed the guest room, the linen closet, and found the downstairs powder room. The light was dim, the sink gleaming with unused polish. She splashed her face with cool water, staring into the mirror. Her reflection looked tired, small. She dabbed her eyes and turned to leave, but paused as she heard a voice, muffled, firm, from the slightly ajar office door nearby. "Thomas, I said next week is not an option," he hissed into the phone. "I don't care what excuse you have. If that money isn't in by Monday, I'll make sure you regret ever getting involved." A pause. "No, you listen. You promised the transfer. If it's not in the account by then, we both know what happens next." Silence. Then, "Don't make me clean up your mess." Margaret's breath caught. She backed away, careful not to let the floorboards creak, and slipped silently back into the bathroom, closing the door. Her heart pounded as she leaned against the cool tile wall. What had she just heard? The tone wasn't business. It was menace, threats, pressure. She waited until the hall was quiet again before flushing the toilet and returning to the dining room. Thomas was back at the table, sipping wine, calm as ever. Amanda smiled stiffly. The kids were eating dessert. Margaret sat down quietly, her mind whirring. What was that call? Who was he threatening? And what did it mean? Her pie sat untouched in the kitchen. Forgotten. No one mentioned it. The dinner resumed like nothing had happened. But for Margaret, everything had changed. The following morning, Margaret awoke with the weight of the previous night still pressing down on her chest. She had barely slept. Thomas's voice from the hallway replayed in her mind like a bad dream. "Don't make me clean up your mess." The calm way he returned to dinner afterward, as if he hadn't just issued a threat, unnerved her. She sat at her kitchen table, staring into her untouched coffee, trying to make sense of it. Margaret had never liked Thomas, his polished charm, his slippery way of dodging questions. But until now, she had no reason to believe there was something more sinister beneath the surface. But that phone call, it was more than arrogance or stress. It was control, power, threat. Margaret knew better than to confront Amanda directly. She had learned that lesson the hard way. If she said anything without proof, Amanda would accuse her of meddling again, of creating drama. But what if it wasn't drama? What if Thomas was involved in something illegal, something dangerous? She needed to talk to someone who understood this world. She thought of Robert Kennedy, not the politician, but the man she had worked with briefly during her time volunteering at the local council decades ago. Robert had once worked in state-level financial investigations before retiring early due to health issues. If anyone could help her understand what she heard, it was him. She picked up the phone and dialed his number from memory, half surprised he still had a landline. "Robert Kennedy speaking," came the familiar, gravelly voice. "Robert, it's Margaret Whitlow. I hope I'm not intruding." "Margaret, my God, it's been years." "Of course you're not. What's going on?" She hesitated. "Can we meet for coffee? It's personal." He didn't ask questions, just gave her a time and place. They met at a small cafe tucked behind a bookstore downtown. Margaret arrived early and claimed a corner booth. Robert walked in 10 minutes later, thinner than she remembered, with a limp in his right leg and a kind smile that hadn't changed. "You look well," he said, sliding into the booth. "I feel ancient," she replied, managing a faint smile. He ordered tea, then leaned in. "What's this about?" She exhaled slowly. "It's my daughter's husband, Thomas. I overheard something last night, a phone call. It didn't sound right. He was threatening someone. Something about money transfers and consequences. Robert's eyes narrowed. What's his line of work? He runs some kind of investment company. High returns, low visibility. Everything about him always felt too polished. I never trusted him. But this felt dangerous. Robert nodded slowly, stirring his tea. What did he say exactly? She recited the fragments she remembered. Robert said nothing for a moment, then tapped a finger against the table. I've heard whispers, he said finally, about guys like him, companies built on recruiting investors with the promise of quick profits, then paying off early investors with new money coming in. Sounds like a classic Ponzi setup, maybe even layered with shell companies. Margaret felt her stomach twist. But that's illegal, isn't it? Oh, deeply, Robert said. But proving it is another matter. They hide behind lawyers, paperwork, shell firms registered offshore. Unless someone from the inside leaks documentation, or unless they screw up, it's hard to bring them down. Margaret looked away, hands tightening around her coffee cup. If I say anything to Amanda, she'll shut me out. She'll think I'm trying to ruin her life. Robert sighed. You don't have proof, just suspicion. And that's dangerous on its own. So what should I do? Watch, listen, document. If you really want to help, don't confront. Gather quietly. And if something feels too big, bring it to someone who can act. Margaret nodded, though her chest ached with uncertainty. He's the father of my grandchildren, Robert. And your daughter's husband, he said, which means, if you're right, she may already know more than she's letting on. That thought hit harder than expected. They parted with a hug and a quiet promise to stay in touch. Back home, Margaret sat at her dining table long into the evening, flipping through old photo albums again, this time looking at Thomas. The early photos showed a smiling young man with ambition in his eyes. But behind that charm, had there always been something else? She closed the album. Robert had told her to watch, to gather, but deep down she knew that if she found something damning, if she exposed it, the fallout would be enormous. She would lose Amanda, maybe forever. And yet, if she did nothing, what if someone else paid the price? That night, after her conversation with Robert, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with her reading glasses perched low on her nose and her laptop humming softly. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the ticking of the old wall clock. Her only company for over a decade. She opened a search engine and hesitated, fingers hovering above the keys. Then she typed, Vlay Strategic Partners Complaints. Dozens of results popped up. Most were buried deep in obscure corners of the internet. Blogs, discussion forums, consumer alert threads. She clicked into one titled, When Strategic Means Scam, My Experience with Vlay Partners. It was a post written by someone who had invested $10,000 and claimed to have never seen a return. Margaret scrolled slowly, absorbing every line. The investor spoke of smooth-talking representatives, vague updates, and increasingly aggressive phone calls when they requested withdrawals. The tone was eerily similar to what Margaret had overheard in the hallway at Amanda's. She clicked another link, a forum thread with hundreds of replies. Most shared similar stories, investments promised to double within months, early payouts used as bait, and then total silence. A few mentioned Thomas Vlay by name, describing him as charming, calculated, and unreachable when things went south. Margaret began copying and pasting the posts into a Word document. She saved screenshots, dated entries, and noted usernames. With each new story, her heart sank further. She created a folder on her desktop titled Thomas DeWatch. It felt surreal, compiling a digital case file on her own son-in-law. But this wasn't just about money. This was about trust, safety, and maybe justice. Hours passed. Outside, the moon had climbed high above the rooftops. Margaret's eyes were dry from staring at the screen, but she kept going. Then she found it, a smaller, less moderated forum called Investor Justice. In a thread titled Warning Vlay Strategic Partners, a Family Affair, one comment stood out. Has anyone looked into the company filings? Amanda Whitlow is listed on multiple legal documents as co-owner and secretary. It's not just Thomas. Margaret sat bolt upright. Amanda? Involved? She clicked the user's name, JV Truthseeker, and scanned their profile. Minimal information, but in a reply to another user, they claimed to have filed a formal complaint with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Without thinking, Margaret typed out a message. Hi, I'm looking into Valet Strategic Partners. I have reason to believe my family is directly involved. Would you be open to speaking privately? She hit send before she could change her mind. 10 minutes passed. Then a reply pinged back. Yes, my name is Janice. I lost everything to Thomas Valet, and I know exactly who Amanda is. Margaret's fingers trembled as she responded. They moved their conversation to email, where Janice introduced herself as a former school administrator from upstate New York. She had invested her retirement savings, $200,000, after a glowing seminar hosted by Thomas and Amanda in Manhattan 3 years ago. They pitched it as a family-run fund, Janice wrote. Amanda presented herself as a silent partner, said she handled legal compliance. It felt warm, authentic. I trusted her. Margaret read the message twice, disbelieving. Amanda was there? She was the reason I invested, Janice replied. She spoke about being a mother, wanting financial security for her kids, and helping other women do the same. I felt like she understood me. Margaret stared at the screen, the weight of Janice's words pressing like a stone on her chest. This wasn't just Thomas's world. Amanda was part of it. She sat back, heart pounding. The woman who had once begged for ballet lessons, who cried on Margaret's lap during her first heartbreak, who now barely returned her calls, had stood on a stage and sold illusions to strangers. Had she known the scam? Or had Thomas convinced her it was all real? Margaret didn't know which answer would hurt more. She returned to her notes, adding Janice's name, her investment story, the seminar in Manhattan. She saved copies of every message, every forum post. Her document was now 20 pages long. At midnight, she closed the laptop slowly. The glow of the screen left ghostly imprints on her retinas. Her kitchen felt darker than usual, colder. She looked at the old clock again. Amanda was complicit. Whether knowingly or blindly, she had stood next to Thomas as he took people's lives apart, and Margaret had once believed that dinner would fix things. Her tea had gone cold hours ago. She dumped it in the sink and stared out the window into the empty backyard. A quiet resolve began to form. This wasn't just about protecting her daughter anymore. It was about protecting those who couldn't see through the smiles. Margaret sat at her kitchen table long after the sun had risen, the morning light slanting through the blinds in dusty rays. Her laptop was shut, but the folder labeled Thomas Watch still burned in her mind like a warning flare. She had barely slept, haunted by Janice's emails and her own rising suspicions. She hadn't yet decided what to do. A part of her wanted to confront Amanda, demand the truth, lay out everything she knew. But another part, the mother in her, hesitated. What if Amanda didn't know? What if she'd been manipulated? What if the confrontation shattered the fragile thread still connecting them? As Margaret poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, the doorbell rang. She stiffened. Visitors were rare. She set the mug down, wiped her hands, and moved to the front door. There, standing awkwardly on the porch, was Amanda. Margaret's breath caught. Her daughter looked pale, her eyes red-rimmed. No makeup, no perfectly styled hair, just a hoodie and jeans. Hands tucked in her sleeves like a child. Amanda? Hi, Mom, Amanda said softly, voice shaking. Can I come in? Margaret stepped aside without a word. Amanda moved into the living room, perching on the edge of the couch like she didn't belong. I'm sorry, Amanda blurted, eyes filling. About the other night, the way I spoke to you, I was angry and defensive, and you didn't deserve it. Margaret stood frozen for a moment, then sat beside her. I appreciate that, she said carefully. It hurt, but I know we both carry a lot. Amanda nodded, wiping her eyes. I've been thinking a lot. About you, about everything. I realized I've been unfair, distant, and I'm sorry. Margaret felt a crack in her chest, the smallest flicker of hope. I just wanted to do things differently with my family, Amanda continued, but I let that turn into pushing you away, and I see now that was wrong. Margaret reached out, placing a hand on Amanda's. You're still my daughter. That never changed. Amanda looked down. I know, and I'm scared. Things with Thomas, it's been stressful. The business isn't doing as well as it used to, and he's different lately, distant, even with me. Margaret didn't speak. She let Amanda talk, watching the lines of tension in her daughter's face soften with every word. I don't know what's happening, really, Amanda said, but I'm trying to figure it out, and I wanted to start by fixing what I can, with you. Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes. For the first time in what felt like years, Amanda wasn't a stranger. She was the little girl who used to climb into her lap and cry over scraped knees. I'm glad you came, Margaret whispered. Amanda sniffed, then offered a tentative smile. Would it be okay if I stayed for dinner? Just us, like old times? Margaret stood. Of course. I'll make something simple. She moved into the kitchen, her steps lighter than they'd been in months. Amanda followed, rolling up her sleeves to help. They made pasta, nothing fancy. Margaret let Amanda choose the music, and soon the house was filled with the soft croon of Billie Holiday. For once, the air wasn't heavy. The silence wasn't hostile. They talked while chopping garlic, shared small laughs over Amanda's inability to properly dice an onion, and even reminisced about a childhood vacation to Cape Cod where Amanda had insisted on swimming in freezing water just to prove she wasn't afraid. Margaret set the table with mismatched plates, the way she always had when Amanda was young. They sat across from each other, steam rising from their bowls, and clinked glasses of iced tea. To second chances, Amanda said. Margaret smiled. To second chances. Dinner passed like a dream Margaret hadn't realized she still hoped for. Amanda asked about her garden, about the books she was reading, about her health. She didn't rush the conversation. She listened. When the meal was done, Amanda helped clear the table without being asked. They washed dishes side by side, passing plates and towels like a well-rehearsed routine from another life. As Amanda dried the last pan, she turned to Margaret. I don't want us to be like this anymore. Distant, suspicious. Can we start over? Margaret felt her throat close up. Yes, we can. They hugged tightly, and Margaret clung to the feeling, not wanting to let go. It was only after Amanda left that night, stepping into the darkness with a wave and a smile, that the doubt crept back in. Had this been real, or had Amanda come to silence the questions Margaret hadn't yet asked? She pushed the thought away. For now, she would hold on to the hope. The morning after the dinner, Margaret woke up with a rare lightness in her chest. For the first time in what felt like years, she felt a sense of calm. Amanda's visit had been human, raw, honest, the kind of connection she thought was lost forever. They had eaten, laughed, even hugged. She allowed herself a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, things could mend. She shuffled into the kitchen, put the kettle on, and then walked down the hallway toward her small office to grab the garden gloves she'd left by the desk. As soon as she pushed the door open, the feeling shattered. The room wasn't how she left it. Her chair was slightly angled away from the desk, the stack of books that had sat neatly in one corner now crooked. Papers from her notebook were out of order, and worst of all, the ceramic tray where she kept her USB drives was empty. Margaret's breath caught. The USB, the one labeled family, a misdirection. It held every document, every screenshot, every email from Janice. She'd hidden it beneath a pile of handwritten recipes to keep it discreet, but now it was gone. Her hands trembled as she clutched the back of the chair. Who had been here? Only one person had come inside the house yesterday. Only one person had hugged her, eaten her food, looked her in the eye, and said she wanted to start over. Amanda. The thought punched her in the stomach. She wanted to deny it, to believe the previous night had been genuine. But the evidence said otherwise. She sat down slowly, staring at the disrupted room. Amanda had come with purpose, not peace. She had searched, found the USB, and left with it, along with Margaret's trust. The betrayal stung deeper than any argument ever could. Margaret stood and moved with purpose. She changed into slacks, combed her hair, grabbed her coat, and left the house without touching her tea. She didn't know what she expected to find, but she knew where she had to go. Vlay Strategic Partners. The office was nestled in a sleek glass building downtown, a far cry from the modest homes of the people it preyed upon. Margaret entered the lobby and approached the receptionist with calm determination. "I'm here to see Amanda Whitlow," she said. The receptionist glanced up, startled. "She's in a meeting?" "Please let her know it's her mother. I'll wait." The woman hesitated, then picked up the phone. Margaret sat in the waiting area, eyes locked on the glass doors at the end of the hallway. After 10 minutes, they opened. Voices raised. Amanda's. "You promised, Thomas. You said this would never touch my mother." Margaret stood quietly, out of sight. Thomas's voice was sharp, furious. "Do you think I meant for her to find that crap online? If she kept her nose out of our business?" "She's my mother," Amanda snapped. "She has every right to be suspicious now. You should have told me it got this far." "You're involved whether you like it or not," Thomas hissed. "You signed the documents, remember?" Margaret's stomach turned. She stepped into the hall. Amanda froze. Their eyes met, and in that moment, every truth that had been hiding behind soft apologies and forced smiles came to light. Margaret's voice was calm. "I was right. You took the USB." Amanda's face paled. "Mom, I trusted you," Margaret continued, walking toward her. "Last night I thought we were healing, but you came to steal." Thomas backed away into the office, wanting no part of the confrontation. Amanda stepped forward, lowering her voice. "I didn't want it to be like this." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Then why lie?" Amanda exhaled, voice breaking. "Because I needed time. Because if you turn this in, if you expose Thomas, you'd destroy everything." Margaret blinked. "Everything? Or your bank account?" Amanda shook her head. "No. Our lives, the house, the kids' school, Luke's therapy. Everything we have is tied to that company." Margaret stepped back, stunned. "So you knew? All along?" Amanda's voice turned bitter. "Not at first, but over time. Yes, I saw things I didn't want to see, and I stayed quiet." "Because it was easier," Margaret whispered. "No, because survival doesn't always look noble." Margaret felt tears burn behind her eyes. "You stood on that stage in Manhattan and sold lies. You looked people in the eye, people like Janice, and made them believe in something hollow." Amanda's face twisted. "Don't you dare bring her up. You think I'm proud of it? I'm not. But I did what I had to do." Margaret's voice was steel. "And what about what I have to do?" Amanda didn't answer. They stood there. Two women locked in a war neither wanted to fight, but neither could walk away from. Finally, Margaret said, "You stole my trust. Now you've lost it." She turned and walked toward the elevator, her heart breaking in pieces too small to count. Behind her, Amanda didn't follow. Margaret drove through the late autumn streets with both hands tight on the steering wheel. Her knuckles were white, her breath shallow, the folder beside her feeling heavier than any burden she had ever carried. Inside were the last remaining documents, screenshots, saved emails, printouts from forums, and a signed statement from Janice. Everything that hadn't been on the stolen USB was now sealed in a manila envelope. She had reread it all last night. Every line, every accusation, every dollar amount lost. The address she headed to wasn't new. She hadn't been there in years, but it was etched into her memory. Evelyn's old lawyer, Sophia Cray, a woman known for her spine of steel and her heart of quiet justice. Margaret hadn't spoken to her since settling Evelyn's estate, but she knew Sophia would be honest, impartial, and discreet. The law office was nestled in a modest brick building near the waterfront. Nothing flashy, just clean glass doors and a bronze plaque. Margaret stepped inside and was greeted by a young assistant who recognized the name immediately. "Sophia said to bring you right in," she said kindly. Sophia Cray stood as Margaret entered. Still tall, still poised, her dark hair now streaked with elegant gray. She wore a charcoal pantsuit and the same round glasses Margaret remembered from a decade ago. "Margaret," Sophia said warmly, but her expression shifted as she took in the tight lines on Margaret's face. "Something serious?" Margaret sat down slowly and slid the envelope across the desk. "I need you to read this, all of it." Sophia opened the envelope without a word, her eyes scanning the documents quickly but thoroughly. She flipped through the pages, occasionally narrowing her gaze or making a quiet under her breath. It took 10 minutes. 10 minutes of silence while Margaret sat unmoving, her heart thudding like a ticking bomb. Finally, Sophia leaned back. "Well," she said calmly, "this is substantial." Margaret exhaled shakily. "It's real then?" "Real enough for concern," Sophia nodded. "If even half of this is accurate, Thomas and possibly Amanda are involved in what appears to be a classic Ponzi scheme, using early investors' money to pay off newer ones, the usual house of cards. And if Amanda signed legal documents, as some of this shows, then she's complicit, at least on paper." Margaret looked down at her lap. "I didn't want to believe it." "I know you didn't," Sophia said gently, "but believing isn't required. Facts are." Margaret swallowed. "If I give this to you, what happens?" "I prepare a disclosure," Sophia replied. "We forward this to the Securities and Exchange Commission anonymously, at least at first. If they deem it credible, they'll launch an inquiry. From there, subpoenas, investigations, possibly indictments." Margaret's hands trembled. Sophia leaned forward. "You understand, Margaret. This isn't just about Thomas. Amanda could be dragged in, deeply." Margaret nodded, eyes wet. "She already is." They sat in silence for a moment. Sophia's voice softened. "I know what it feels like, to hand over something that could tear your family apart. But this isn't just about Amanda. It's about the people who lost everything, the retirees, the single mothers, the ones who won't recover." "I know," Margaret whispered. "Janice trusted her because she thought she was like her." Sophia reached across the desk and placed a pen beside the authorization form. "If you want me to move forward, sign this. I'll take care of the rest." Margaret stared at the form, the lines of legalese blurring into shadow. Her vision swam. She thought of Annie, of Luke, of Amanda crying in her living room saying she wanted to start over. Was it all manipulation, or had there been truth in it? Did Amanda even know where the performance ended and the guilt began? She picked up the pen. Her fingers shook. "Will I lose her forever?" Margaret asked, barely above a whisper. Sophia didn't lie. "Maybe." Margaret pressed the pen to paper and signed. When she set the pen down, she felt hollow, not triumphant, not vindicated, just empty. Sophia gathered the documents and nodded. "I'll file this before the end of the day." Margaret stood slowly. "Thank you." As she walked out of the office, the weight in her chest remained. She had done the right thing, but sometimes doing the right thing didn't feel righteous. Sometimes it just felt like loss. 3 days later, the headline appeared online in the early hours of a rainy morning. "Vlay Strategic Partners under federal investigation for securities fraud." Margaret stared at the screen, the glow casting a pale light over her quiet kitchen. The article was concise. Vague details, no names yet, but it was enough. The company was being investigated. The SEC had begun preliminary inquiries, citing multiple complaints and growing evidence of financial misconduct. The words felt like distant thunder rolling in. She knew Amanda would see it. Everyone in their world would. By noon, the phone rang. Margaret let it buzz twice before picking up, already knowing who it was. "Mom!" Amanda's voice cracked on the other end, choked and frantic. "Did you do this?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She stared at the framed photo of Annie on the fridge, her heart heavy. "Tell me the truth," Amanda begged. "Was it you?" Margaret closed her eyes. "It was me." A sharp inhale, followed by silence. "I had to," Margaret continued. "You knew what he was doing. You knew." Amanda's voice broke. "You don't understand. We were fixing it. We were close to making it right." "No," Margaret cut in gently. "You were close to burying it deeper. "You've ruined everything," Amanda screamed. "Do you know what this means? Our accounts are frozen. Annie's tuition, Luke's therapy." "I know what it means," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the shaking in her chest. "I know exactly what it means." "I didn't do this for me," Amanda sobbed. "I did this for them, for my kids, for their future." "And what about the other kids?" Margaret asked quietly. "The ones whose parents trusted you, the ones who can't afford a second chance." Amanda went quiet. Margaret's voice dropped. "I begged for your attention for years, Amanda. I needed you. I needed my daughter. Where were you then? I was trying to survive. So was I," Margaret whispered. Amanda's breath came in ragged bursts. "You've destroyed us. The line went dead. Margaret set the phone down gently. Her hands were trembling, but not from guilt, from grief. The grief of a mother who had just burned the last bridge to her child. Outside, the rain tapped steadily against the windows. Margaret made herself tea and sat in silence, the scent of chamomile failing to comfort. Later that afternoon, Sophia called. "They're moving quickly," she said. "The SEC requested additional documentation. I'll be forwarding what you gathered. You might be contacted for a statement." Margaret nodded, though Sophia couldn't see her. "Are you okay?" Sophia asked gently. "No," Margaret admitted, "but I will be." There was a pause. Then Sophia said, "There's something you should know about Evelyn." Margaret's brows knit together. "What about him?" "When he passed, he left a separate savings account under Amanda's name. It was in his handwritten will, but not mentioned publicly. He wanted her to have something private, independent. I assumed you had given it to her." Margaret went still. "I didn't." Sophia's tone was careful. "Why?" Margaret looked down at her hands. She was 21, just married. She was reckless, impulsive. I thought if I handed her that money, she'd waste it. I thought it would be better to teach her to stand on her own. Sophia didn't respond right away. It wasn't mine to question. But that money might have changed things. "I know," Margaret said quietly. She hung up shortly after and walked to the old wooden cabinet in the corner of her bedroom. Inside, wrapped in a faded scarf, was the original envelope Evelyn had sealed years ago. It contained bank documents, a check, and a letter addressed to Amanda in her father's handwriting. She had kept it all this time, unopened. Margaret sank onto the bed, the envelope in her lap. She had once told herself it was an act of wisdom, withholding the money, a lesson in independence. But now, holding it in her hands, she wasn't so sure. Had it been control? Fear? A punishment wrapped in good intentions? Amanda had never known, and now, in the rubble of everything collapsing, Margaret wasn't sure she ever could. Outside, thunder rolled gently through the sky. Margaret stayed where she was, the weight of every choice pressing down on her shoulders like rain that would never stop. The house was quiet, save for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. Margaret sat at her desk with a pen in hand, her notepad open before her, and a manila envelope filled with legal forms beside her cup of now cold tea. The soft rustle of old papers accompanied her like the whisper of memories refusing to be forgotten. She had spent the last few days in a quiet fog, her thoughts moving slowly but surely towards something final. Not dramatic, not bitter, just necessary. Margaret picked up the pen and began to write the first line of her new will. I, Margaret Elaine Whitlow, being of sound mind and body, declare this to be my last will and testament. There was a strange calm in the act. She didn't feel fear or anger. She felt clarity. Years of uncertainty and unspoken wounds had finally settled into shape. Not a clean one, not easy, but one she could look at without turning away. She moved through the usual language, revoking all prior wills, declaring her residence, affirming her intent. Then came the part that truly mattered. She wrote the names of her grandchildren, Annie Grace Vlay and Luke Benjamin Vlay. She specified that her home, modest as it was, her remaining savings, and every possession of sentimental value, her books, her heirloom jewelry, even her gardening tools, were to be held in trust until each of them reached the age of 25. Not because she didn't trust them, but because life had taught her the value of time, how the choices made at 20 could echo for decades. There was no mention of Amanda, no space left for Thomas. Those parts of her legacy were gone, erased not out of vengeance, but out of acceptance. Margaret had finally learned that not every connection needed to be preserved to prove it once existed. Some were meant to end. She signed each page with deliberate care, her signature firm and elegant, just as her mother had taught her. When it was done, she sealed the will in a fresh envelope, wrote Sophia Cray's name on the front, and placed it in the center drawer of her desk. Then she reached into the bottom drawer and pulled out the last remaining documents she had tied to Amanda and Thomas, copies of company filings, tax records, even old holiday letters with polished lies. She stacked them on the fireplace grate, one by one, until the pile stood tall and pointed like accusation. She lit a match. The flame caught quickly, consuming the paper with a hunger that felt both tragic and right. Margaret sat on the nearby armchair and watched the past curl into ash. Not out of hate, out of closure. This was not revenge. It was release. She looked around the room, the fading wallpaper, the worn wooden floor, the shelf where Amanda's kindergarten drawings still rested behind dusty glass. This house had been a fortress, a sanctuary, a prison. Now it was becoming something else. A message. A vessel of truth, left behind for the ones who would need it when they were old enough to understand. Later that evening, she pulled out 2 more items, her old camera and a stack of blank note cards. She took photos of the rooms she wanted Annie and Luke to remember. Her garden, her bookshelves, the stained glass window above the stairwell, and on each card, she wrote small letters to accompany them. Annie, this was where your mother used to read by the window. She loved Jane Austen, even if she'd never admit it. Luke, this was where your mom spilled a whole pitcher of lemonade on a summer afternoon. I told her the stain added character. There were no accusations in the notes, no confessions, just fragments of a life honestly lived. Margaret placed the photos and letters in a small box and labeled it simply, "For the future." She didn't know when or if Annie and Luke would ever receive it, but she believed in time. Time revealed, time healed, and sometimes time forgave. As the fire in the grate died down to glowing embers, Margaret wrapped herself in her favorite shawl and sat on the porch, watching the stars peek through the clouds. She didn't know what would come next. Whether Amanda would ever call again, whether Thomas would face prison, whether the silence in her home would one day grow too heavy. But for the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. She had done what she could. She had told the truth, and she had made sure the future had a foundation stronger than the past. It was a gray morning, 1 week after the documents had been filed, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp leaves. Margaret was trimming the last of her late-blooming roses in the garden when she heard the soft crunch of tires on gravel. She straightened, brushing soil from her gloves, and turned toward the driveway. A silver SUV pulled up quietly. The door opened. Amanda stepped out. She looked thinner, more fragile than Margaret remembered. Her face was pale, eyes tired, and in her arms was Annie, bundled in a lavender hoodie and holding a small duffel bag. Amanda didn't wave. She didn't smile. She walked up the path with quiet, deliberate steps. Margaret stood still, unsure whether to step forward or stay rooted. Her heart thudded in that strange rhythm that only mothers knew, hope tangled with fear. Amanda stopped at the bottom step. "She needs a place to breathe," Amanda said softly. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. Amanda's voice was brittle, like it would shatter if pushed. "I won't stay," Amanda added quickly. "Just please, let her stay the night." Margaret looked at Annie, who gave a small, hopeful smile. "Of course," Margaret said gently. Amanda bent and kissed Annie's head. "Be good," she whispered. Then, without another word, she walked back to the SUV, pulled out of the driveway, and was gone. Margaret didn't chase her. She didn't call out. She simply turned to her granddaughter and held out her hand. "Come on, sweetheart," she said. "Let's make something warm." Annie settled into the house like she'd never left. She kicked off her shoes by the door, unpacked a sketch pad and colored pencils onto the kitchen table, and asked if they still had the vanilla ice cream with caramel swirls. Margaret smiled, pulled 2 bowls from the cupboard, and they spent the afternoon as if time had folded in on itself. They painted together in the sunroom, ate grilled cheese sandwiches for dinner, and watched a documentary about sea turtles that had Annie asking endless questions. But as the evening deepened and the house grew quiet, a soft melancholy settled over Margaret. The laughter faded, the shadows returned, and she knew there were things she needed to say, things Annie deserved to hear. That night, after the dishes had been put away and Annie had taken a warm bath, they sat together in Margaret's bedroom under a thick quilt. "Annie," Margaret said gently, brushing the girl's damp hair back, "can I tell you a story before bed?" Annie nodded, snuggling closer. "It's about a woman," Margaret began, "who lived in a house with too many memories. She had a daughter she loved very much, but one day, her daughter stopped seeing the good the woman had done and only remembered what hurt." Annie was quiet, watching her with wide eyes. "This woman tried very hard to fix things," Margaret continued. "She made mistakes, so did her daughter, and in the end, the woman had to make a choice. One that meant telling the truth, even if it broke her heart." "Was she scared?" Annie whispered. Margaret nodded, more than anything, but she believed that sometimes the truth is the only way to build something stronger. Annie looked down at her hands, thoughtful. "What happened to the daughter?" Margaret paused. "She left, but she left behind something very special." Annie tilted her head. "What?" "You," Margaret said softly. "She left you." Annie didn't flinch. She didn't cry. Instead, she leaned her head against Margaret's shoulder. "I know," Annie whispered. "She cried when she put me in the car. She said, Grandma is the only person who really knows what's right." Margaret froze. Annie looked up at her. She didn't say it angry. She said it like she was sad but sure. Margaret's chest tightened, and for the first time in years, tears welled in her eyes, not from grief or betrayal or loss, but from something purer, softer, hope. She held Annie close, burying her face in her granddaughter's hair, letting the tears come. Silent, warm healing. Annie hugged her back. Neither of them spoke. The night moved on, slow and peaceful. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and the stars blinked faintly through the clouds. Margaret didn't know what would happen tomorrow, whether Amanda would return, whether forgiveness would come. But tonight, in the arms of her granddaughter, she didn't need to know. Because sometimes, love isn't loud. It's quiet. It's in the leaving, and it's in the coming back.